The fog of a November morning in 1895 hung thick over Baker Street, transforming the familiar thoroughfare into a realm of muffled sounds and ghostly silhouettes. Within our comfortable lodgings at 221B, however, the coal fire burned cheerfully in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the familiar chaos of books, papers, and scientific apparatus that marked our sitting room as the domain of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. My friend sat in his customary chair, his sharp profile illuminated by the firelight as he examined a curious fragment of tobacco ash through his magnifying lens. His grey eyes, those remarkable instruments of observation that had solved so many of London's most perplexing mysteries, were focused with characteristic intensity upon his specimen. I had learned long ago not to disturb him during such moments of concentration, for Holmes's mind worked in ways that ordinary mortals could scarcely comprehend. The morning's tranquility was shattered by the urgent clatter of boots upon our stairs, followed by Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock. Before she could announce our visitor, the door burst open to admit Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his usually composed features marked by an expression of profound bewilderment. Behind him followed a distinguished gentleman of middle years, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, though his hands trembled slightly as he removed his silk hat. "Holmes?" Lestrade began without preamble, his voice carrying an unusual note of desperation. "I've brought you a case that defies all reason. This is Mr. Pemberton, senior partner at Pemberton & Associates, architectural consultants." Holmes set down his lens with deliberate precision and regarded our visitors with those penetrating eyes. "Good morning, gentlemen. Inspector Lestrade, I observe that you have been examining a crime scene involving considerable dust and old mortar. The particular shade of grey upon your sleeve suggests a building of Georgian construction, while the slight abrasion on your right palm indicates you have been forced to climb or crawl through a confined space. Mr. Pemberton, you are left-handed, recently returned from examining architectural drawings. The India ink stain upon your cuff is quite distinctive, and you have spent considerable time in the past week in the company of building plans that have caused you significant distress." Pemberton's eyes widened in astonishment. "Remarkable, Mr. Holmes. Your reputation for observation is well deserved. Indeed, I have been poring over blueprints that have become the source of my greatest professional nightmare." "Pray be seated, gentlemen," Holmes said, gesturing toward our chairs with fluid grace. "Mr. Pemberton, I suspect your nightmare involves a building that challenges the very principles of architecture itself." The architect drew a shuddering breath. 3 months ago, my junior partner, Mr. Edmund Blackwood, approached me with the most extraordinary commission. Wealthy recluse named Cornelius Ashford had purchased a plot in Belgravia and desired a house built according to most unusual specifications. The structure was to appear perfectly normal from the street, a handsome Georgian facade with proper windows and stonework, but it was to have no front door whatsoever. "No door?" I interjected, leaning forward with interest. "None visible from the street, Dr. Watson. The entry was to be concealed through an elaborate system of hidden passages accessible only from the adjoining property." Edmund was fascinated by the challenge, and the fee was substantial, paid in advance and in cash. I confess, the eccentricity of the request should have given me pause. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "And I assume this architectural impossibility has been completed?" "It has, Mr. Holmes, and therein lies our tragedy." Pemberton's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Yesterday morning, Edmund Blackwood was found dead inside that very house. But here is what defies comprehension. The building was discovered to be completely sealed. The police had to break through a wall to reach his body." Lestrade cleared his throat gruffly. "Tell them the rest, Mr. Pemberton. The whole impossible business." "The house stands complete at 47 Eaton Square," Pemberton continued, his hands clasping and unclasping nervously. "From the street it appears as any proper Georgian residence might, save for the absence of a front entrance. But when we attempted to locate the hidden passages Edmund had designed, we found them sealed with fresh mortar. Every window is barred from within, every potential entry point blocked. The rear of the property connects to no adjoining building, and the roof offers no practical access. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the grey morning light. Yet Mr. Blackwood was found within. In the central drawing room, Lestrade confirmed, consulting his notebook. Seated in a chair as though he had simply fallen asleep. The preliminary examination suggests heart failure, though the coroner hasn't completed his report. No signs of violence, no obvious wounds. But Holmes, the room where we found him, it's impossible that anyone could have entered or left it. The cause of death may be natural, Holmes murmured, turning back to face us, but the circumstances are decidedly unnatural. A man found dead in a house that, by your account, never had a door through which he could have entered. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of London awakening beyond our windows. Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mr. Pemberton," he said at length, "I shall require a complete set of the original blueprints, any correspondence regarding this commission, and your professional assessment of the building's construction. Inspector Lestrade, I trust the scene remains undisturbed?" "Nothing has been touched since we removed the body," Lestrade assured him. "I've posted a constable to ensure the premises remain secure." "Excellent." Holmes moved to his desk and began gathering his magnifying glass, measuring tape, and notebook. "Watson, bring your medical bag and your revolver. We have an architectural impossibility to examine, and I suspect that before this day is through we shall discover that the most improbable explanation is often the most probable truth." As we prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I found myself contemplating the extraordinary nature of the puzzle that had been presented to us. A man dead in a house without doors, trapped within walls that should have been his protection, but had instead become his tomb. It was the sort of mystery that would challenge even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction. The hansom cab that carried us through the grey morning toward Belgravia seemed to move through a world transformed by mist and shadow, as though we were travelling not merely across London, but into the realm of the impossible itself. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door had begun, and already I sensed that nothing would prove to be quite as it appeared. The fog that had shrouded Baker Street began to lift as our hansom approached the elegant squares of Belgravia, revealing a world of Georgian respectability where every house stood in perfect conformity to architectural tradition. Yet as we drew closer to our destination, I found myself contemplating Holmes's words during our journey, his observation that the human mind, when confronted with apparent impossibility, often retreats into supernatural explanations rather than seeking the ingenious truth that lies beneath. "Watson," Holmes had remarked, his keen gaze fixed upon the passing streetscape. "Premeditation often involves carefully crafted deception. The more elaborate the deception, the more likely it is to rely on fundamental misdirection, a trick of perception rather than an actual violation of natural law." Now, as our cab drew to a halt before 47 Eaton Square, the truth of his words became immediately apparent. The house stood with almost defiant normalcy among its neighbors, its cream-colored facade adorned with elegant stonework and perfectly proportioned windows. Yet where one expected to find a front door with its customary steps and portico, there was instead an unbroken expanse of wall, a deliberate rejection of architectural convention that seemed to whisper of secrets and forbidden entry. Holmes alighted with characteristic energy, his sharp gaze immediately taking in every detail of the building's exterior. He produced his magnifying glass and began a methodical examination of the facade, paying particular attention to what should have been the entrance. "Fascinating," he murmured, running his fingers along the stonework. "Watson, observe the color variation in the mortar here. Fresh Portland cement has been worked into joints that originally held Roman cement. The grey tone is distinctly different, suggesting recent ceiling work executed with considerable skill to match the original construction. Inspector Lestrade approached from where he had been conferring with the constable on duty. The neighbours have been asking questions all morning, Holmes. They say the house has been under construction for months, but no one recalls seeing workmen in recent weeks. Yet someone completed this ceiling, Holmes replied, kneeling to examine the lower stonework with his lens. Trowel marks in a right-handed sweep, and here he collected a pinch of dust from a sheltered ledge, rolling the grains between his fingers before lifting them to his nose. Mortar dust, fine sand, and a filament of horsehair. Mixed plaster where one would expect only lime mortar. Someone has been sealing interior spaces in considerable haste. We made our way around the building's perimeter, Holmes noting every architectural detail while Pemberton consulted his blueprints with increasing agitation. The rear of the property backed onto a narrow mews, but there was no connection to any adjoining building that might have provided the hidden access described in the original plans. The concealed passage through number 45's basement, Pemberton explained, his voice strained. When we investigated yesterday, we found only solid wall. It's as though Edmund designed the passages and then sealed them permanently. At that moment, a timid tapping drew our attention to the street. A maid in a dark cloak stood hesitantly by the railings, her cheeks reddened by the cold. The constable would have waved her away, but she twisted her hands and pleaded, "Beg pardon, sir. I serve at number 49 with Lady Aurelia. I saw the gentleman go in, and I thought, might I tell what I saw?" Lestrade softened at the prospect of a witness. "Out with it, girl." "It were the night before last, sir. I stood at our scullery window and saw a bluish light flickering from up in that house. There. And a buzzing sound, sharp-like as when the electricians were at our gas fittings. Second time in a week I'd seen that queer light, and at dusk a cart came. No Coleman's call, no knock. Just a shadow at the corner, and gone. Holmes's eyes took on that glitter I knew so well. "Electricity and deliveries at dusk," he murmured. "Most illuminating." The constable led us to where the police had been forced to break through the wall to reach Blackwood's body. The breach revealed masonry nearly 2 feet thick, solid stone and brick that spoke to substantial, purposeful construction. "Took 4 men with sledgehammers the better part of an hour," Lestrade explained as we entered through the improvised opening. The interior drawing room was elegantly appointed, though everything bore a thin layer of dust, suggesting recent abandonment. Holmes began his examination with methodical precision, his magnifying glass moving over every surface. Blackwood was found in that chair. Lestrade indicated a leather armchair near the fireplace. Sitting upright, hands folded, peaceful as you please. Doctor said he simply stopped breathing. Holmes examined the chair minutely, then moved to study the room's proportions. "Watson, by my measurement, this room is a quarter less in width than the frontage would allow. 18 to 20 inches, a significant void within the facade." He moved to the windows, each fitted with heavy iron bars set deep into the masonry. "These barriers are not decorative, Inspector. They ensure no possibility of entry or exit." His fingers paused where one bar met the stonework. "This bar differs from its fellows, slightly looser, with traces of copper verdigris rather than iron corrosion. Copper wire has been used here recently." At the fireplace, Holmes extracted with his tweezers a fragment of charred parchment. Burned papers, but suppressed before complete combustion. The watermark reads, H&S, Old Kent Road, and here, deliveries to be at dusk. Holmes straightened, his grey eyes reflecting the calculation that preceded his most brilliant deductions. Edmund Blackwood transformed this house into an impregnable fortress, sealing himself within. But was he protecting himself from an external threat, or ensuring that something within could never escape? The electrical activity, the antiseptic supplies we observed in the basement, the systematic sealing of every passage, all suggest a man preparing for something far more complex than simple isolation. The implications of his words sent a chill through the sealed chamber, and I found myself wondering what secrets this architectural impossibility might yet reveal. The drawing room of 47 Eaton Square held secrets that revealed themselves only to the most methodical examination. Holmes approached his investigation with the precision of a surgeon, beginning with the leather armchair where Edmund Blackwood had been discovered in his final repose. The chair itself bore no obvious signs of disturbance, no scuff marks upon the Persian carpet beneath, no indication of struggle or sudden movement. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, kneeling beside the chair and producing his magnifying lens. The positioning of our unfortunate architect was entirely natural. His hands were folded, his posture relaxed. This was not a man who died in fear or agitation, but rather one who simply ceased. Upon the mahogany occasional table beside the chair sat the mundane artifacts of a gentleman's evening: a tarnished silver snuff-box, a meerschaum pipe still bearing traces of Turkish tobacco, and a crystal tumbler containing the remnants of what appeared to be fine brandy. Holmes lifted the glass with careful fingers, swirling the amber liquid gently before bringing it to his nose. "French cognac of excellent vintage," he observed, "yet note the unusual sediment at the bottom, Watson. Not the natural precipitation one expects from aged spirits." He carefully decanted a small sample into a vial from his pocket. The preliminary examination suggested heart failure, but I suspect Mr. Blackwood's final evening was more complex than it appeared. As Holmes continued his examination, I recorded the room's contents with professional thoroughness: the faded William Morris wallpaper, the heavy velvet drapes framing the barred windows, the collection of architectural treatises lining mahogany shelves. To my eyes, it presented the comfortable study of a learned gentleman, albeit one who had chosen peculiar isolation. "The air itself tells a story," Holmes remarked, drawing a deep breath. "Beneath the expected mustiness of a sealed chamber, there lingers something else, a faint but unmistakable trace of carbolic acid. Someone has attempted to cleanse this room of more than ordinary dust and debris." He moved to examine the walls with systematic precision, producing his collapsible measuring tape and comparing the room's dimensions against Pemberton's blueprints. His movements grew increasingly focused as he approached the eastern wall. "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes announced, tapping the wall-papered surface with his knuckles, "your architectural plans indicate a solid, load-bearing wall here, yet the acoustic properties suggest otherwise. Listen carefully." The hollow reverberation was unmistakable once attention was drawn to it. Holmes traced his fingers along what appeared to be a seamless expanse of wallpaper, but his trained eye detected the faintest irregularity, a hairline seam that had been painstakingly concealed. "The wallpaper has been removed and reapplied," he explained, pressing gently against a decorative rosette in the molding. "And here." A soft click echoed through the room as a section of the wainscoting shifted slightly inward. A concealed panel, though one that has not been opened recently. The mechanism is stiff with disuse. With characteristic boldness, Holmes produced a length of wire from his pocket, fashioned a small hook, and coaxed the panel fully open. A narrow passage was revealed, running parallel to the street-facing wall, a hidden corridor that explained the discrepancy in the room's dimensions. "Lestrade, bring your lantern," Holmes called, slipping into the confined space without hesitation. The passage was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, its floor bearing a thin layer of undisturbed dust save for a single set of footprints. Narrow boots with continental styling, far smaller than Blackwood's substantial frame would have required. The hidden corridor contained two carefully constructed apertures fitted with sliding metal plates, observation points that would have provided an unobstructed view of Eaton Square. Near one of these openings, something pale had caught upon a splinter of wood. "A fragment of fine cambric," Holmes observed, lifting the material with his tweezers. "Exquisitely woven and bearing embroidered initials, A.D. The linen is of the finest quality, suggesting a lady of considerable refinement. Lady Aurelia Desborough, of number 49, Lestrade volunteered. Her household was mentioned by the maid, who witnessed the electrical activity. An intriguing connection, Holmes replied, carefully preserving the fabric sample, though we must resist premature conclusions. The presence of this material in a supposedly sealed passage raises questions that extend beyond simple architectural curiosity. We descended to the basement, where the atmosphere grew thick with the mingled odors of carbolic acid and something sharper, an almost metallic tang that spoke of electrical apparatus. The cellar had been transformed into something resembling a laboratory, its walls lined with glass vessels and copper apparatus of considerable sophistication. Leclanché cells, Holmes identified, indicating a series of large glass jars fitted with zinc and carbon electrodes. A dozen of them, arranged to provide substantial electrical current, and here, he gestured toward a brass and ebonite instrument mounted upon a wooden bench. A Ruhmkorff induction coil of the larger pattern. This apparatus would produce the blue electrical discharge our witness observed, accompanied by the characteristic buzzing sound of the interrupter mechanism. Insulated copper wires ran from the apparatus into the ceiling, disappearing into the building structure. Holmes traced their path with his eye to where they entered an iron pipe that rose alongside the chimney flue. Electrical current conducted throughout the building, he mused. But for what purpose? The installation is far more elaborate than mere illumination would require. Wooden crates lay broken in one corner, their straw packing still clinging to the slats. The shipping labels bore the mark of Hollings and Stroud, Old Kent Road, the same firm referenced in the partially burned correspondence we had discovered upstairs. Upon shelves along the far wall stood an array of chemical bottles, phenol, ether, perchloride of mercury, and, most ominously, prussic acid, its stopper sealed with wax that had been recently broken and resealed. Medical supplies, I observed with growing unease, though the combination suggests purposes beyond ordinary treatment. Prussic acid, in particular, has few therapeutic applications. Holmes examined the bottles without touching them, his expression growing increasingly grave. The electrical apparatus, the chemical preparations, the systematic sealing of the building all suggest that Mr. Blackwood was engaged in work that required absolute secrecy and perfect isolation. He knelt beside the stone floor, where newer mortar indicated recent construction work. The same fresh cement we observed above, Watson. Someone has been sealing spaces throughout this building with considerable urgency. As we prepared to return to the upper floors, Holmes paused at the foot of the stairs, his grey eyes reflecting the calculation that preceded his most brilliant deductions. "We have discovered the apparatus of a secret enterprise," he said quietly, "one that required electrical excitation, chemical preservation, and complete concealment from the outside world. But the most intriguing question remains: was Edmund Blackwood the architect of this mystery, or merely its final victim?" The implications of his words followed us back through the sealed chambers of the house, where every room seemed to whisper of secrets that had died with their keeper. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door was revealing layers of complexity that extended far beyond architectural impossibility into realms of science and deception that challenged the very boundaries of Victorian propriety. The fog that had shrouded London throughout the morning began to lift as we emerged from the sealed house, revealing the elegant Georgian facades of Eaton Square in their full architectural splendor. Yet the normalcy of the scene served only to emphasize the profound abnormality of what we had discovered within number 47. Holmes paused upon the pavement, his keen gaze traveling methodically from window to window of the neighboring properties, before leading us toward the narrow mews that ran behind the terrace. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes observed, producing his magnifying glass, While you pursue the obvious implications of our cambric fragment, I suggest we examine the more practical question of how Mr. Blackwood's mysterious supplies reached their destination. The mews presented the customary bustle of London's service thoroughfares, grooms washing carriages, stable boys attending to their duties, the familiar sounds and scents of urban equestrian life. Yet Holmes's trained eye immediately detected what others might overlook. At the rear wall of number 47, flush with the brickwork at knee height, an iron panel no larger than a baker's tray lay embedded in the masonry. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, kneeling to examine the metalwork with his lens. "Fresh tool marks upon the screws, paint that differs subtly from its surroundings, and here a smear of white lead upon the adjacent brick, hastily applied to conceal recent work." He produced his thin blade and carefully levered the panel a fraction. A cold breath issued from the gap, carrying the unmistakable taint of carbolic acid mingled with something more subtle and disturbing. "A delivery chute," Lestrade concluded with satisfaction. "The mysterious supplies from Old Kent Road found their way through here." "Indeed," Holmes replied, allowing the panel to close softly. "And note the scattered packing straw, swept carelessly against the wall. Not stable litter, but the remains of crated goods. Our evening deliveries were accomplished with considerable discretion." We made our way to number 49, where Lady Aurelia Desborough received us in a drawing-room that spoke eloquently of refined taste and considerable means. She was a woman of perhaps 45 years, possessed of that particular elegance that comes from breeding rather than mere fashion. Her dark hair was arranged in the latest style, and her afternoon dress was of the finest silk, yet there was something in her manner, a barely perceptible tension that suggested our visit was not entirely unexpected. "Gentlemen," she said, offering tea with practiced grace, "I confess I anticipated your arrival. The tragic circumstances at number 47 have been the subject of considerable speculation among the residents of the square." Holmes accepted the refreshment with polite acknowledgement, though his attention was clearly focused upon studying our hostess rather than the excellent China tea. His gaze moved with characteristic precision from the embroidered monogram upon her napkin to the slight discoloration upon her right forefinger, a mark that might have been caused by chemical staining or electrical burn. "Lady Desborough," Holmes began with careful neutrality, "we understand that your household staff observed unusual phenomena at Mr. Blackwood's residence, electrical activity and irregular deliveries. My maid Sarah is observant, though perhaps given to embellishment," Lady Desborough replied, her fingers toying absently with the pearl brooch at her throat. "She reported strange lights and sounds, but I confess I paid little attention to such domestic gossip." "Yet you were acquainted with the deceased gentleman?" I inquired. A slight flush colored her pale cheeks. "We had met on several occasions. Edmund was a man of considerable learning, though his recent interests had become unconventional. He spoke of architectural innovations that seemed to border upon the fantastical." Holmes produced the fragment of cambric from his pocket with theatrical precision. "This material was discovered within a concealed passage in Mr. Blackwood's residence. The embroidered initials appear to correspond with your own." Lady Desborough examined the fabric without flinching, though I detected the slightest tremor in her voice when she spoke. "Indeed, this appears to be mine. A handkerchief I often carry. I must have dropped it during one of my visits to Edmund's laboratory." "Laboratory?" Lestrade leaned forward with obvious interest. "Edmund had transformed portions of his house into a workshop for his experiments," she explained, rising to move toward the window. "He was fascinated by the intersection of architecture and natural philosophy, particularly the application of electrical forces to preservation." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with sudden attention. "What manner of preservation, Lady Desborough?" "He believed that electrical stimulation could arrest the natural processes of decay," she replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "His work was brilliant, though perhaps not entirely conventional." At that moment, A young man entered the drawing room with a smooth deportment that suggested familiarity with aristocratic households. He was spare of frame, impeccably dressed, his boots of a narrow cut and high instep such as one sees in continental establishments. His dark hair was precisely groomed, and his eyes held the measured watchfulness of a man who trusts no one entirely. "Lady Aurelia," he said with a slight accent that I could not immediately place. "Forgive the interruption. I was unaware you were receiving visitors. Gentlemen, may I present my cousin, Mr. Adrian Dacre," Lady Desborough said, though something in her manner suggested the relationship might be more complex than familial. "Adrian assists me with correspondence and various projects." Holmes studied the young man with obvious interest, his gaze lingering upon those narrow continental boots. "Mr. Dacre, you maintain an interest in architecture." "I appreciate fine craftsmanship," Dacre replied carefully, "though I cannot claim professional expertise." "Yet you are familiar with Mr. Blackwood's work." The young man's composure remained perfect, though I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. "Only through Lady Aurelia's descriptions. I never had occasion to visit the gentleman's residence." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, though I sensed his mind was cataloguing every detail of Dacre's appearance and manner. "Lady Desborough, you mentioned visiting Mr. Blackwood's laboratory. Might I inquire how you gained access to a building that appeared to be hermetically sealed?" Lady Desborough moved to a bookcase that lined the eastern wall of her library. With practiced ease, she pressed a concealed mechanism, and a section of the shelving swung inward to reveal a narrow passage, identical in construction to the one we had discovered in Blackwood's house. "Edmund designed this connection," she explained. "It allowed discreet consultation regarding his work without attracting unwanted attention. The passage runs beneath the foundations of both properties." Lestrade's satisfaction was evident. "So you had access to the sealed house, Lady Desborough. When did you last visit Mr. Blackwood?" 3 evenings ago," she admitted. "I found Edmund in a state of considerable excitement. He claimed to be on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize our understanding of life itself. I left him well after midnight, using this passage to return home." Holmes examined the hidden doorway with his characteristic thoroughness, noting the fresh dust upon the floor and the absence of recent disturbance. "You sealed the passage after your departure?" "As was our custom, to maintain the secrecy of Edmund's endeavors." As we prepared to take our leave, Holmes paused at the threshold. "Lady Desborough, Mr. Dacre, I trust you will both remain available for further questioning. This investigation has revealed complexities that extend far beyond architectural curiosity." Once we had returned to the street, Lestrade's enthusiasm was barely contained. "We have our culprit, Holmes. Lady Desborough admits to being in the house. Her handkerchief was found in the passage, and she had both motive and opportunity. The case is as good as closed." Holmes, however, wore that inward expression I had learned to recognize as profound skepticism. "You are enamored of a solution because it appears complete, Inspector. Yet consider, a woman of Lady Desborough's sophistication leaves behind a monogrammed handkerchief in a concealed passage, then admits freely to her presence when questioned. Either she is remarkably careless for a murderess, or remarkably confident that her admissions will not incriminate her." "What do you suggest?" I asked. "I suggest," Holmes replied, glancing back at the elegant facade of number 49, "that we have been presented with a suspect so convenient as to be almost theatrical. The question becomes, is Lady Desborough our perpetrator, or merely another player in a drama orchestrated by a more cunning intelligence?" The fog was beginning to thicken again as we made our way back toward Baker Street, carrying with us more questions than answers. The case of the murder in the house. That never had a door had revealed its first suspect, but Holmes's instinct suggested that the true mystery had only begun to unfold. The November afternoon was drawing toward dusk as we returned to the familiar sanctuary of 221B Baker Street. where the gaslight cast its warm glow across the sitting room that had witnessed the unraveling of so many seemingly impossible mysteries. Holmes moved immediately to his chemical apparatus, his long fingers working with practiced precision as he prepared slides from the various samples we had collected throughout our investigation. Inspector Lestrade, meanwhile, paced our sitting room with barely contained satisfaction, his notebook clutched triumphantly in his hand. "The case is as clear as crystal, Holmes," he declared with conviction. "Lady Desborough admits to being in the house. Her monogrammed handkerchief was found in the secret passage, and she had both motive and opportunity. I'll have the warrant drawn before evening." I found myself initially swayed by the inspector's reasoning. The evidence did appear to form a compelling narrative, a woman of refinement drawn into dangerous scientific experiments, perhaps seeking to control or suppress discoveries that had grown too perilous. Yet as I observed Holmes's methodical examination of our samples, I detected that familiar tension in his manner that suggested his remarkable mind was grappling with contradictions that defied easy resolution. "Watson," Holmes said without looking up from his microscope, "what is your medical assessment of the crystalline residue we extracted from Mr. Blackwood's brandy glass?" I examined the slide he indicated, noting the distinctive formation under magnification. The structure is unmistakable. Potassium cyanide, certainly, yet the concentration appears remarkably dilute. "Precisely," Holmes murmured, adjusting the focus with delicate precision. "Present in quantities sufficient to be detected by chemical analysis, yet insufficient to cause death in a man of Blackwood's constitution. We have evidence of poisoning that could not have been fatal, a curious contradiction that suggests deliberate deception rather than failed murder." He straightened from his apparatus and moved to examine once again the fragment of cambric we had discovered in the hidden passage. His magnifying lens revealed details that had escaped our earlier inspection. "This handkerchief troubles me profoundly," Holmes continued, his gray eyes reflecting the peculiar intensity that preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Lady Desborough's ready admission of ownership was too complete, too confident. A guilty party would deny such damning evidence, while a truly innocent one would struggle to explain its presence." "Perhaps she genuinely dropped it during one of her visits," I suggested. Holmes shook his head slowly, returning to his examination. "Consider the evidence more carefully, Watson. When we discovered this passage, what did you observe about the condition of the dust upon the floor?" I cast my mind back to our exploration of the narrow corridor. There was a thin layer of undisturbed dust throughout most of the passage, save for a single set of small footprints, presumably those narrow continental boots worn by Mr. Dacre. "Excellent observation, and on Lady Desborough's side of the passage. Similarly dusty, though I noticed the dust appeared undisturbed except for those same small prints." Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Now recall the precise location where we found the handkerchief. The dust was disturbed only in the immediate vicinity of the fabric itself, as though something had been placed there deliberately, not dropped during passage through the corridor. The implication struck me like a physical blow. You mean the handkerchief was planted?" "The evidence strongly suggests it," Holmes replied grimly. "If Lady Desborough had traversed that passage 3 nights ago, as she claims, we would expect to find her footprints alongside those we observed. Instead, we find localized disturbance around planted evidence, a handkerchief that shows signs of recent embroidery work." Before Lestrade could voice his obvious objections, Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock announced an unexpected visitor. To our surprise, Adrian Dacre entered our sitting room, though his earlier composed demeanor had given way to obvious agitation. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of haste, and his narrow continental boots bore fresh mud from the London streets. "Mr. Holmes," he began, without preamble, his slight accent more pronounced in his distress, "I must speak with you regarding Lady Aurelia's situation. I fear she has become entangled in circumstances far more dangerous than she realizes." Holmes gestured toward our chairs, though he remained standing, his sharp gaze fixed upon our visitor with renewed interest. Mr. Dacre, your timing is most fortuitous. We have just discovered evidence suggesting deliberate deception in this case. Then you understand the true peril, Dacre replied, accepting the offered seat with evident relief. Lady Aurelia's involvement with Blackwood was entirely innocent, though I fear it may appear otherwise to those who judge by surface appearances. Enlighten us regarding the true nature of their association, Holmes said, his tone carefully neutral yet expectant. Dacre drew a steadying breath before continuing. I have not been entirely truthful about my identity, gentlemen. I'm Dr. Adrian von Dux, formerly of the University of Vienna. I came to London seeking patronage for research that had become unwelcome in more conservative academic circles. Research into what manner of natural philosophy? Holmes inquired with sharp attention. The application of electrical force to biological systems, von Dux admitted reluctantly. Specifically, the possibility of restoring vital functions to recently deceased tissue through galvanic stimulation. Lady Aurelia provided both financial support and laboratory facilities, while Blackwood's architectural expertise allowed us to create the perfect environment for our experiments. I felt my medical training rebel against such possibilities, yet I recalled the extensive electrical apparatus we had discovered in the sealed house. You speak of reanimating dead tissue. Such theories belong to Gothic novels, not legitimate scientific inquiry. Yet the principles are sound, von Dux insisted. Galvani demonstrated muscular response to electrical stimulation decades ago. Aldini achieved temporary animation of executed criminals through similar methods. We sought to extend these principles to achieve permanent restoration of life. Holmes ceased his pacing, his expression reflecting the calculation that preceded his most startling revelations. Dr. von Dux, you speak of these experiments in the past tense. Had your research been abandoned? On the contrary, von Dux replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Blackwood claimed to have achieved unprecedented success. 3 nights ago, he summoned Lady Aurelia to witness what he described as his greatest triumph. She returned home in a state of profound shock, speaking of horrors that defied rational explanation. What manner of horrors? Holmes pressed. She would not elaborate, save to say that Blackwood had succeeded beyond his wildest ambitions, and that the result was an abomination against nature itself. She spoke of something that moved, yet was not truly alive, that possessed awareness, yet lacked what we might term a soul. Holmes returned to his chair, his gray eyes reflecting satisfaction at having penetrated another layer of deception. Dr. von Dux, I believe you possess knowledge crucial to understanding Mr. Blackwood's death. The systematic sealing of his residence, the electrical apparatus, the chemical preparations, all suggest a man preparing for an experiment of unprecedented scope and danger. Indeed, von Dux confirmed gravely, Blackwood intended to demonstrate the ultimate application of our theories. He believed he had discovered the secret of conquering death itself, of achieving permanent restoration of life to deceased tissue. And the result of this ultimate experiment. Von Dux met Holmes's penetrating gaze with evident reluctance. I fear, Mr. Holmes, that Edmund Blackwood may have succeeded all too well. The question is not whether he died of natural causes, but whether what killed him was entirely natural in its origin. The silence that followed his words was profound, broken only by the familiar sounds of London evening beyond our windows. Lestrade sat stunned, his notebook forgotten in his lap, while the implications of von Dux's revelation settled over our sitting room like a shroud. Holmes remained motionless, his sharp profile illuminated by the firelight, his remarkable mind clearly racing to connect these new revelations with the physical evidence we had gathered. The convenient suspect had proven to be merely a pawn in a far more complex game, while the true nature of the mystery was revealing itself to be something that challenged the very boundaries between life and death. Dr. von Dux, Holmes said at length, his voice carrying a note of grim determination, I believe the time has come for complete honesty. The life of an innocent woman may depend upon our understanding of exactly what Edmund Blackwood created in that sealed laboratory, and whether it yet poses a danger to the living. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door had revealed its most crucial secret, not the identity of a conventional murderer, but the possibility that Edmund Blackwood had died at the hands of his own impossible creation, while someone else orchestrated an elaborate deception to conceal the truth. The revelations of Dr. Adrian von Dax had transformed our comfortable sitting room at 221B Baker Street into a theater of scientific horror. Holmes sat motionless in his chair for several minutes after our visitor's departure, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point beyond the gaslight's reach, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of profound concentration I had learned to recognize as the herald of his most brilliant deductions. Then, with characteristic suddenness, he sprang into action. He moved to his chemical apparatus with renewed purpose, examining once again the samples we had collected from Blackwood's sealed laboratory. His movements were precise, yet fevered, as though driven by an urgency that had not been present before von Dax's terrible revelations. "Watson," he said without looking up from his microscope, "the trace amounts of potassium cyanide in Blackwood's brandy, insufficient to cause death, yet sufficient to render a man insensible. Consider the implications." I felt a chill of understanding. "You believe Blackwood was incapacitated, not poisoned, prepared for his own experimental procedures?" "Precisely. The carbolic acid, the electrical apparatus, the systematic sealing of the building, all consistent with a man preparing to demonstrate the ultimate application of galvanic reanimation upon himself." Holmes straightened, his expression reflecting both fascination and revulsion. But something went catastrophically wrong. He moved to his desk and began composing telegrams with rapid, decisive strokes. "To the coroner. Hold body of Edmund Blackwood under strictest security. No access without my presence. To Hollings and Stroud. Require immediate inventory of all deliveries to Eaton Square. Confidential." Before he could summon Mrs. Hudson to dispatch these messages, urgent footsteps clattered upon our stairs. Inspector Lestrade burst into our sitting room, his usually composed features marked by profound alarm. "Holmes, there's been another incident at Eaton Square. The delivery boy from Old Kent Road, found dead in the mews behind number 47. We were in a hansom within minutes, racing through the fog-shrouded streets toward Belgravia. The scene that greeted us in the narrow mews was both tragic and illuminating. A young lad of perhaps 14 years lay motionless upon the cobblestones, his face bearing the telltale discoloration of cyanide poisoning. Holmes knelt beside the small form, his examination swift but thorough. "The same bitter almond scent, Watson. But observe." He lifted the boy's grimy hand, revealing traces of white paint beneath the fingernails. He attempted to force entry through the delivery panel we discovered yesterday. Moving to the rear wall of number 47, Holmes examined the iron panel with his magnifying lens. The metal showed fresh scratches and gouges where someone had attempted to pry it open. More significantly, traces of a crystalline residue clung to the inner edges. "An ingenious trap," Holmes observed grimly. "A glass vial containing prussic acid vapor designed to shatter when the panel was forced upward. Our mysterious adversary has been eliminating potential witnesses with methodical precision." Lestrade's telegram boy appeared at that moment, breathless with urgency. "Message from the coroner's office, sir. Attempt made to view Blackwood's body by gentleman claiming family connection. Refused entry. Later discovered mortuary window forced. Body remains secure, but attendant overcome by unknown vapors." Holmes crushed the telegram in his fist, his eyes blazing with that fierce intensity that danger always brought to him. "The game accelerates, Watson. Our adversary seeks to retrieve something from the dead while eliminating evidence from the living." We returned immediately to Lady Aurelia's residence at number 49. where we discovered signs of a struggle that chilled my blood. The elegant drawing room was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, a marble bust shattered upon the floor, deep gouges scored into the polished parquet as though something of immense strength had clawed its way across the room. Lady Aurelia received us in her library, her usual composure shattered by the night's events. "Gentlemen, I confess I am at my wits' end. The sounds from below, electrical buzzing, mechanical grinding, continued throughout the night, and Adrian, Dr. Von Dax, has vanished without explanation." Holmes examined the concealed passage entrance with meticulous care. The wooden mechanism showed signs of having been forced from within, and a peculiar viscous residue clung to the frame. Neither blood nor any natural substance I could identify. "Lady Desborough," Holmes said with grave authority, "I believe Dr. Von Dax has fallen victim to the very forces he helped to create. The reanimated specimen that attacked Blackwood has not perished with its creator, but has achieved a terrible mobility." From his pocket, Holmes produced a fragment of desiccated plant matter, its veins glowing with faint phosphorescence. "This leaf, from Blackwood's rare electrical fern, was found in your drawing room. It has been subjected to immense galvanic stimulation, evidence that the creature carries with it the apparatus of its unnatural animation." At that moment, a distinguished gentleman entered the library with the confident bearing of one accustomed to command. I recognized him immediately as Mr. Pemberton, the senior architect who had accompanied Lestrade to Baker Street that morning. "Lady Aurelia," he said smoothly, "I came as soon as I heard of the disturbance. These tragic events have shaken the entire square." Holmes regarded the newcomer with sharp attention. "Mr. Pemberton, your timing is most fortuitous. We have just discovered evidence suggesting a conspiracy of considerable complexity surrounding your late partner's death." Pemberton's composure remained perfect, though I detected a slight tightening around his eyes. "I fear I don't understand your meaning, Mr. Holmes." "Then perhaps this will clarify matters," Holmes replied, producing a ledger from his coat. "Delivery records from Hollings and Stroud, showing extensive shipments of anatomical preparations consigned to your architectural firm. Materials that found their way to Blackwood's sealed laboratory through channels that required your direct authorization." The mask of respectability slipped for just an instant, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Mr. Holmes, I fear you are drawing conclusions that exceed the available evidence." "On the contrary," Holmes continued relentlessly, "the evidence suggests you were not merely Blackwood's professional partner, but the financial architect of his most dangerous experiments. The sealed house, the electrical apparatus, the systematic acquisition of human specimens, all required resources and connections far beyond a junior architect's means." Lady Aurelia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Mr. Pemberton, surely you cannot have been involved in such horrors." "The horrors, my dear lady, were entirely of Blackwood's devising," Pemberton replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I merely provided the means for scientific advancement. The fault lies with his inability to control what he created." Holmes moved to position himself between Pemberton and the passage entrance. "And now you seek to eliminate all evidence of your involvement, including the witnesses who might expose your complicity. The boy in the mews was an unfortunate necessity," Pemberton admitted with chilling calm, "as was the attempt to retrieve certain documents from Blackwood's remains. But I assure you, gentlemen, my actions serve the greater good. The world is not ready for the knowledge that died with Edmund Blackwood." The electrical buzzing that had plagued the building throughout the night suddenly intensified, rising to a pitch that made the very walls seem to vibrate. From somewhere beneath our feet came a sound that defied rational explanation. A rhythmic pounding, as though something of immense strength was attempting to break free from its confinement. "I fear, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said with grim satisfaction, "that your attempts to contain Blackwood's legacy have failed. The creature he created has not only survived its creator's death, but has grown in strength and purpose. The true horror of this case is not what has already occurred, but what may yet be unleashed upon London. The pounding from below grew more insistent, and Lady Aurelia clutched my arm in terror. "Gentlemen, what manner of thing moves in that sealed house?" Holmes's grey eyes reflected both fascination and dread as he contemplated the architectural impossibility that had become a prison for something that challenged the very boundaries between life and death. "That, my dear lady, is precisely what we must discover before this night is through. For I fear that Edmund Blackwood's greatest creation is about to announce itself to the world in a manner that will test every principle of natural philosophy we hold sacred." The case of the murder in the house that never had a door had revealed its darkest secret, not merely the identity of a conspiracy, but the existence of something that should not exist, trapped within walls that might not hold it much longer. The rhythmic pounding from beneath our feet had evolved into something far more ominous. The systematic destruction of masonry that spoke of inhuman strength applied with deliberate purpose. Holmes stood motionless in the center of Lady Aurelia's library, his grey eyes reflecting that peculiar intensity that marked his moments of greatest mental exertion, while fine particles of ancient mortar drifted from the ceiling like ghostly snow. "The creature has abandoned random violence for methodical engineering," Holmes observed with clinical detachment. "It seeks not merely escape, but the systematic expansion of its domain." Most illuminating. Mr. Pemberton's earlier composure had entirely disintegrated. He moved restlessly about the room, his hands clasping and unclasping behind his back, his eyes darting repeatedly toward the concealed passage entrance. "Mr. Holmes, surely you understand that public exposure of these events would be catastrophic. The scandal alone would destroy the scientific establishment. Your concern for scientific reputation rings hollow from a man who has systematically eliminated witnesses," Holmes replied with icy precision. "But fear not, Mr. Pemberton. I propose to resolve this matter with complete discretion, though perhaps not in the manner you anticipate." Dr. von Dax entered at that moment, his appearance bearing the unmistakable signs of recent subterranean exploration. His narrow continental boots were caked with lime mortar and brick dust, his usually immaculate clothing torn and stained with substances that gleamed faintly phosphorescent in the gaslight. "Dr. von Dax," Lady Aurelia exclaimed, rising to assist him to a chair. "We feared the worst when you disappeared." "I have spent the past hours in reconnaissance," von Dax replied, accepting the brandy she pressed upon him with obvious gratitude. "The creature has achieved remarkable adaptation to its environment. It has learned to manipulate the electrical systems throughout the building, creating a network of galvanic stimulation that maintains its animation even when separated from the primary apparatus." Holmes leaned forward with sharp attention. "Describe its current capabilities." "Its physical strength is prodigious. I witnessed it tear through 2-foot masonry as though it were pasteboard. More disturbing, it demonstrates clear evidence of memory, purpose, and learning. It recognizes the individuals involved in its creation and appears to be systematically gathering materials for expansion of its activities." "Expansion?" I inquired, though I dreaded the implications. "It seeks to create additional specimens," von Dax confirmed grimly. "The creature understands that its existence depends upon the continuation of the electrical processes that animate it, and it has begun constructing apparatus to replicate those processes." Holmes rose and moved to Lady Aurelia's writing desk, where he began composing messages with characteristic precision. "Gentlemen, Lady Desborough, the time has come for decisive action. Our adversary possesses intelligence, purpose, and growing capability. We must lure it into circumstances where these very advantages become the instruments of its destruction." He outlined his strategy with methodical thoroughness. The creature would be drawn into a carefully prepared trap through the promise of fresh materials and enhanced electrical apparatus. However, the very systems it sought to exploit would be modified to deliver a massive galvanic discharge sufficient to disrupt the delicate electrical balance maintaining its unnatural existence. The principle is elegant in its simplicity, Holmes explained, producing from his coat a collection of specialized apparatus, insulated copper wire, glass ampoules containing various chemical preparations, and a curious brass device fitted with adjustable contacts. We shall employ the creature's own electrical dependency against it, creating a surge that will overwhelm its capacity for adaptation. He moved to examine the concealed passage entrance with his magnifying lens, noting every detail of the mechanism's construction. Mr. Pemberton, your architectural knowledge will be essential. The building's electrical systems must be modified to concentrate the full power of every Leclanché cell simultaneously into a single, devastating discharge. Pemberton's objections were immediate and vehement. The risk is unacceptable. Such a surge would be visible throughout Belgravia. The authorities would investigate. Questions would be asked. Questions will certainly be asked if this abomination escapes into London proper, Holmes interrupted with steel in his voice. You will cooperate fully, or I shall ensure that your role in these events receives the complete attention it deserves from both the press and the courts. The architect's resistance crumbled under Holmes's relentless logic. What would you have me do? You will accompany us into the sealed laboratory and assist in the modification of the electrical apparatus. Your complicity in Blackwood's experiments makes you uniquely qualified to understand the creature's vulnerabilities. Holmes then began his preparations with a methodical precision that had solved so many seemingly impossible cases. He produced a small copper dish, into which he poured a dark, viscous liquid from one of his glass vials, followed by a fine white powder that caused the mixture to emit a faint, sweet and sour odor, reminiscent of organic decay. A chemical attractant, he explained, positioning the dish near the passage entrance. The creature will be drawn to this signature as inevitably as a moth to flame. Dr. von Dax, you mentioned that it responds to electrical stimulation. We shall provide stimulation beyond its capacity to absorb. He then turned his attention to the electrical wiring that connected Lady Aurelia's house to Blackwood's laboratory. With insulated pliers, he made a series of rapid adjustments, rerouting connections and bypassing the safety mechanisms that would normally prevent dangerous overloads. Watson, Holmes said, handing me a length of heavy copper wire. When I give the signal, you will connect this to the main circuit breaker. The resulting surge will channel the full electrical capacity of both buildings into Blackwood's apparatus, a surge that will temporarily overwhelm our specimen's adaptive capabilities. Lady Aurelia rose with obvious determination. Gentlemen, I insist upon accompanying you. These horrors began with my patronage of the research, and I will not shirk my responsibility for their resolution. My dear lady, Holmes replied gently, the dangers involved are considerable. No greater than the dangers of allowing this abomination to continue its existence, she interrupted with surprising firmness. I have witnessed Blackwood's creation, Mr. Holmes. I understand precisely what we face. Holmes studied her with obvious respect before nodding his acceptance. Very well, but you will follow my instructions absolutely, without question or hesitation. As we prepared to descend into the concealed passages that connected the elegant Georgian terraces, Holmes paused at the threshold. The sounds from below had intensified, the systematic destruction of masonry accompanied by a wet, scraping noise that spoke of something powerful and utterly unnatural moving through spaces never designed for such occupation. The trap is set, Holmes announced, his grey eyes reflecting both determination and the peculiar exhilaration that danger always brought to his remarkable nature. Our adversary seeks electrical enhancement and fresh materials for its unholy work. We shall provide both, along with a demonstration of the fundamental principle that even the most sophisticated mechanism can be destroyed by the simple expedient of providing more power than it was designed to contain. He produced his service revolver and checked its chambers with practiced efficiency. Watson, your medical bag and weapon, Dr. Von Dux, gather every piece of portable electrical apparatus you can carry. Mr. Pemberton, prepare yourself to confront the consequences of your ambitions. Tonight, we shall determine whether the forces of natural philosophy can triumph over the abominations that challenge the very foundations of life and death. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door was approaching its climactic resolution, though none of us could predict whether we would emerge as victors or merely the latest victims of Edmund Blackwood's impossible creation. The trap was ingeniously set, but the prey we sought to capture possessed capabilities that defied every principle of natural science we held sacred. The concealed passage beneath Eaton Square had been transformed into a conduit of unnatural science, its brick walls scarred by copper wiring that pulsed with phosphorescent energy. Holmes led our small procession with characteristic determination, his service revolver held steady as we descended deeper into Edmund Blackwood's architectural impossibility. The rhythmic pounding that had echoed through Lady Aurelia's residence had ceased, replaced by a low, mechanical humming that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Dr. Von Dux moved behind Holmes with obvious trepidation, his narrow continental boots navigating the debris-strewn floor with practiced care. Lady Aurelia followed with remarkable composure, though I detected the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her inner turmoil. Mr. Pemberton brought up the rear, his earlier protests silenced by the weight of impending revelation, while Inspector Lestrade remained positioned at the passage entrance with his constables, ready to seal our retreat if necessary. The laboratory that had once been Blackwood's basement kitchen now resembled something from the fevered imagination of a natural philosopher gone mad. The Ruhmkorff induction coil dominated the center of the chamber like a brass and ebonite altar, its polished surfaces reflecting the blue-white discharge that crackled between its terminals. Multiple Leclanché cells lined the walls in solemn procession, their zinc plates corroded by constant use, their carbon rods glowing with residual energy. But it was the figure hunched over the electrical apparatus that commanded our immediate attention. The thing that had once been Edmund Blackwood retained the general proportions of a man, though one rebuilt according to principles that owed nothing to divine creation. Its flesh bore the mottled discoloration of prolonged electrical stimulation, while copper filaments had been integrated directly into its nervous system, creating a network of artificial conductivity that pulsed with rhythmic energy. Edmund Blackwood, Holmes announced with calm authority, stepping into the creature's field of vision. The reanimated architect turned at the sound of its former name, and I found myself staring into eyes that retained a terrible awareness. When it spoke, its voice carried the mechanical quality of apparatus rather than the natural warmth of human speech. Yet the intelligence behind the words was unmistakably present. Holmes, Watson, you have penetrated my sanctuary at last. Your sanctuary, Holmes replied steadily, is nothing more than an elaborate tomb, animated by galvanic force but lacking the essential spark that constitutes true life. You're not Edmund Blackwood reborn, but merely an echo of his consciousness, trapped within tissue that should have been allowed its natural rest. The creature's laugh was a sound that combined human bitterness with the harsh buzz of electrical discharge. You understand so little, Holmes. Death was merely a transformation, not an ending. I have achieved what natural philosophers have dreamed of for centuries, the conquest of mortality through the application of scientific principle. Holmes moved closer, his grey eyes studying the elaborate apparatus with professional interest. Yet you require constant electrical stimulation to maintain your existence. You are not truly alive, but merely a sophisticated mechanism, animated by galvanic force, a biological engine that consumes power to maintain the illusion of life. An illusion that learns, that adapts, that creates, the creature replied, gesturing toward a collection of smaller specimens arranged upon examination tables throughout the chamber. I have improved upon the original design, Holmes. These newer subjects require less electrical maintenance and demonstrate greater independence of thought. At that moment, Mr. Pemberton stepped forward, his earlier reluctance replaced by obvious fascination. The implications for medical science are staggering. Edmund, you have transcended the very limitations of human existence. Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon the architect. Mr. Pemberton, your enthusiasm reveals the depth of your complicity in these abominations. You provided not merely the architectural expertise for this sealed laboratory, but the financial resources and illicit connections necessary to acquire the human specimens required for Blackwood's experiments. Pemberton's composure cracked under Holmes's relentless logic. I facilitated legitimate scientific research. The advancement of human knowledge requires, Holmes interrupted with steel in his voice, the systematic violation of every principle of medical ethics, the acquisition of fresh cadavers through criminal means, and the transformation of this elegant Georgian residence into a charnel house of unnatural science. The creature that had been Blackwood moved with sudden purpose toward a complex arrangement of copper mesh and glass vessels. Enough philosophical debate, Holmes. You have witnessed my achievement. Now you must decide whether to join me in transcending the limitations of mortal existence or be consumed by the very forces you seek to understand. Holmes raised his hand in warning, and I saw his fingers close around the electrical apparatus he had prepared. Dr. Von Dax, observe carefully the creature's dependency upon external electrical stimulation. Note how the copper filaments integrated into its nervous system converge upon that central induction coil. The reanimated Blackwood's attention sharpened dangerously. You seek to disrupt my electrical matrix, Holmes, but you fail to comprehend the sophistication of my modifications. I'm no longer dependent upon crude external apparatus. Indeed, Holmes replied with grim satisfaction, and therein lies your fundamental vulnerability. A system that has integrated electrical stimulation into its very tissue can be overwhelmed by precisely calibrated overload. With lightning swiftness, Holmes activated the apparatus he had concealed within his coat, sending a massive surge of concentrated electrical energy through every wire and connection in the chamber. The creature's scream combined human agony with the shriek of overloaded machinery, while sparks erupted from every metallic surface as the delicate balance of its artificial existence was catastrophically disrupted. "Watson!" Holmes shouted above the electrical chaos. "The main circuit breaker, now!" I plunged the heavy copper wire into the primary electrical connection, channeling the full power of both buildings' electrical systems into Blackwood's apparatus. The resulting discharge was blinding in its intensity, filling the chamber with the acrid smell of burning insulation and ozone. The creature convulsed under the electrical assault, its phosphorescent eyes blazing with unnatural fire before dimming to lifeless gray. The copper filaments that had sustained its animation began to smoke and corrode, while the rhythmic pulsing that had marked its artificial heartbeat gradually slowed and ceased. Dr. Von Dax, with desperate courage, completed the circuit by connecting his portable apparatus directly to the creature's chest. The final surge of electrical energy coursed through the reanimated tissue, disrupting the galvanic processes that had maintained its impossible existence. The thing that had been Edmund Blackwood collapsed upon the laboratory floor, its grotesque form finally still. The mechanical humming that had filled the chamber faded to silence, while the phosphorescent glow that had marked its unnatural animation dimmed to nothing. Holmes stood over the smoking remains, his breath coming in short gasps, his gray eyes reflecting both triumph and profound unease. "The abomination is no more," he announced quietly. "Edmund Blackwood's grand experiment has concluded, and its legacy is nothing but corruption and the violation of natural law." Pemberton stared at the destruction with obvious horror. The knowledge, the scientific advancement, all lost. "Some knowledge," Holmes replied with cold finality, "is too dangerous to preserve. The boundary between life and death exists for reasons that transcend human ambition, and those who violate it do so at the peril of their very souls." As the electrical apparatus finally fell silent, I found myself contemplating the terrible price of scientific hubris. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door had revealed its darkest secret. Not merely the reanimation of dead tissue, but the creation of something that challenged the very foundations of natural philosophy and moral law. Yet even as we stood among the smoking ruins of Blackwood's impossible achievement, I sensed that Holmes's remarkable mind was already calculating the implications of what we had witnessed. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the knowledge that had made such horrors possible remained, and with it, the possibility that others might attempt to follow Blackwood's path into the realm of unnatural science. The fog of London seemed to press against the sealed windows of the laboratory, as though the city itself sought to contain the terrible secrets that had been born within these walls. But secrets, as Holmes had taught me, have a way of revealing themselves when least expected, and I could not shake the feeling that our victory over Blackwood's creation was merely the first act in a larger drama that would test the very boundaries of human knowledge and moral responsibility. The acrid smoke of overloaded electrical apparatus hung thick in the basement laboratory as Holmes began his systematic examination of the evidence that would complete our understanding of this most extraordinary case. The creature that had been Edmund Blackwood lay motionless among the ruins of its own creation, while the silence that followed our electrical assault seemed to press against the sealed walls like a living thing. Holmes approached the aftermath with characteristic precision, his magnifying lens revealing details that would escape ordinary observation. Yet there was something different in his manner, a gravity that spoke to the profound moral implications of what we had witnessed. "Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen, Lady Desborough," Holmes began, his voice carrying that measured tone which I knew preceded his most complete revelations. "Permit me to reconstruct the true sequence of events that led to this architectural impossibility and the horrors it concealed." He moved to the central apparatus, where the massive Ruhmkorff induction coils still smoldered from our assault. "We begin not with murder in the conventional sense, but with the systematic preparation for the most dangerous experiment in the history of natural philosophy. Edmund Blackwood conceived a laboratory whose first principle was absolute secrecy, and whose second was complete isolation from the moral constraints of civilized society. Holmes produced from his coat a collection of evidence I had not seen him gather: metal fragments, chemical residues, and most significantly, a brass screw whose threading showed distinctive wear patterns. "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes continued, his gray eyes fixing upon the architect with implacable intensity, "your complicity extends far beyond mere financial support. This screw, removed from the induction coil's interrupter mechanism, bears the characteristic burring of left-handed adjustment. Your left-handedness, I observed at Baker Street. More significantly, the metal shows traces of India ink identical to that which stained your cuff when you examined architectural drawings." Pemberton's composure began to crack under Holmes's relentless logic. "You build castles upon scratches and speculation, Mr. Holmes." "Upon scratches, dust, and death," Holmes replied with steel in his voice. "The exterior ceiling of this building shows right-handed trowel work, hired labor completed after the fact. But within these chambers, where the electrical apparatus required precise calibration, every adjustment bears the mark of your personal involvement." Holmes moved to examine the creature's remains with clinical detachment. The modifications to Blackwood's nervous system were not the crude experiments of an amateur, but the refined work of someone with extensive knowledge of both electrical principles and human anatomy. These notebooks reveal at least 3 distinct contributors: Blackwood's architectural precision, von Dax's Germanic scientific notation, and your meticulous financial calculations, Mr. Pemberton. He produced a leather portfolio that had been concealed within Blackwood's personal effects, but most damning of all are these documents outlining your true intentions: correspondence regarding the commercial application of reanimation technology, detailed business plans for what you termed electrical restoration services, and financial projections for offering artificial immortality to those wealthy enough to purchase it. Lady Aurelia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "You mean to say they intended to profit from these abominations?" The evidence is unambiguous, Holmes confirmed. 3 nights ago, when Blackwood prepared for his ultimate demonstration, you visited this laboratory not as a supportive partner, but as a man who had grown terrified of his own creation. You altered the electrical apparatus, transforming a controllable induction into a continuous, high-frequency torment sufficient to throw even a strong heart into fatal fibrillation. Holmes knelt beside the induction coil, pointing to specific modifications invisible to untrained eyes. By adjusting the interrupter mechanism, you ensured that Blackwood's experiment would become his execution. The potassium cyanide in his brandy, insufficient to cause death, but adequate to render him insensible during the electrical stimulation, was meant to ease his transition into artificial existence. Instead, it left him helpless as your sabotaged apparatus murdered him. Dr. Von Dax stepped forward, his face pale with dawning comprehension. But the creature that emerged, how do you explain its animation after Blackwood's death? The electrical modifications Blackwood had made to his own nervous system, Holmes explained, combined with the continuous current from your altered apparatus, created an unintended consequence. The copper filaments integrated into his tissue continued to conduct electrical impulses, creating a grotesque semblance of life that retained memory and intelligence but lacked human conscience. Holmes rose and moved to examine the barred window where we had discovered copper verdigris. This single bar, different from its fellows, was modified to draw current from the building's electrical system. The creature used it to supplement its power requirements, explaining the blue electrical discharge our witness observed from the street. Inspector Lestrade had been scribbling furiously in his notebook throughout Holmes's exposition. And the handkerchief we found in the passage? Holmes produced the cambric fragment with theatrical precision. A masterpiece of misdirection, Inspector. The monogram thread shows machine twist consistent with commercial embroidery, while Lady Desborough's personal linen bears the softer twist of hand-embroidered work. The edges had been singed with chemical heat to mask the sharpness of a recent cut, and it was planted after the dust had settled in the passage. He indicated the floor of the concealed corridor. The footprints we observed were of a single narrow continental boot, Dr. Von Dax's earlier reconnaissance, without the broader print that Lady Desborough's shoe would have left. You sought to eliminate a potential witness while directing suspicion toward an innocent patron of science. Pemberton's final defense crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence. Do you think I could permit that obscenity to reach public knowledge? The scandal would have destroyed not merely our firm, but the entire scientific establishment. You speak the creed of every tyrant, sir, Holmes replied with cold finality. The law will provide its own answer to your justifications. As Lestrade's men led Pemberton away, Holmes turned his attention to the apparatus that had sustained the creature's unnatural existence. With methodical thoroughness, he began feeding documents into the laboratory's furnace. Research notes, chemical formulations, detailed specifications for electrical modifications. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Von Dax protested, you are destroying knowledge that could revolutionize medical science. I'm destroying knowledge that would corrupt the very foundations of human existence, Holmes replied with absolute conviction. Some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, Doctor. The line between life and death is foremost among them. As the last of the documents crumbled to ash, Holmes surveyed the wrecked laboratory with grim satisfaction. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door is now concluded. Edmund Blackwood died not at the hands of a conventional murderer, but as the victim of his partner's betrayal and his own impossible ambitions. The creature that killed him was merely the logical consequence of scientific hubris, unconstrained by moral consideration. Lady Aurelia approached Holmes with obvious relief and gratitude. Mr. Holmes, how can I ever thank you for saving me from such terrible accusations? Your courage in the face of these horrors has been its own reward, Lady Desborough. You sought to advance human knowledge through generous patronage, not to enable the perversion of natural law. As we prepared to leave the sealed laboratory forever, Holmes paused at the threshold. The fog of London pressed against the barred windows as though the city itself sought to contain the terrible secrets that had been born within these walls. "Watson," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of profound moral reflection, "we have witnessed tonight the ultimate corruption of the scientific method, the transformation of legitimate inquiry into an instrument of unnatural ambition. Let this serve as a reminder that knowledge without wisdom is perhaps the most dangerous force in our modern world." The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the implications of what we had discovered would remain with us always. A sobering reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved and some knowledge is too perilous to possess. The house without a door had finally yielded its secrets, and in doing so had taught us that the most impenetrable barriers are often those we construct within our own souls. The grey dawn that broke over Eaton Square carried with it the acrid scent of ozone and charred insulation, mingling with London's eternal fog to create an atmosphere that seemed to whisper of secrets too dangerous for daylight. Holmes stood upon the pavement before the house that had never possessed a door, his sharp profile etched against the morning light, while workmen began the systematic erasure of Edmund Blackwood's architectural impossibility. Inspector Lestrade supervised the removal of evidence with characteristic efficiency, though I detected in his manner a profound unease that spoke to the extraordinary nature of what we had uncovered. The brass fragments of electrical apparatus, the chemical residues, the notebooks filled with forbidden calculations, all would find their way to the furnaces of Scotland Yard, where fire would accomplish what moral restraint should have prevented. "The official report," Lestrade confided as we watched the last of the equipment emerge from the sealed basement, "will speak only of financial conspiracy and death by misadventure. Pemberton's scheme to defraud investors in fictitious electrical enterprises provides a narrative that satisfies official requirements without venturing into realms that would challenge the very foundations of natural philosophy. Mr. Charles Pemberton himself stood in handcuffs beside the police wagon, his earlier composure entirely shattered. The architect who had dreamed of commercializing artificial immortality now faced charges of conspiracy, manslaughter, and the unlawful procurement of anatomical specimens, an aggregate of offenses sufficient to ensure his permanent removal from society, though the darkest truths would never see the inside of a courtroom. Dr. Adrian von Dax approached with obvious reluctance, his narrow continental boots navigating the morning-dampened cobblestones with careful precision. His earlier enthusiasm for forbidden research had been entirely extinguished by our confrontation with its ultimate consequences. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his slight accent more pronounced in his distress, "I must ask your forgiveness for my role in these terrible events. My pursuit of scientific advancement blinded me to the moral implications of what we were attempting." Holmes regarded the young scientist with compassion rather than condemnation. "Dr. von Dax, the desire to push beyond the boundaries of human knowledge is among our species' most noble impulses. The fault lies not in the ambition itself, but in the willingness to abandon ethical constraints in its pursuit. Turn your remarkable intellect toward paths that heal rather than violate. If you require an argument stronger than mine, look to your own conscience and to the face of the thing we destroyed." Von Dax bowed his head like a penitent. "You have my word, Mr. Holmes. Vienna shall see me next in the clinic, not the laboratory." Lady Aurelia emerged from her residence at number 49, her usual elegance restored, though her eyes still bore the shadow of what she had witnessed. She carried with her a sealed envelope containing a complete account of her involvement, including detailed financial records that would assist in ensuring proper justice. "Your courage throughout this ordeal has been exemplary, Lady Desborough," Holmes said, accepting her documentation with a slight bow. "You sought to advance human knowledge through generous patronage, not to enable the perversion of natural law. The scientific community would benefit greatly from patrons who combine your generous spirit with your moral clarity." As the morning progressed, we witnessed the systematic erasure of the horrors that had been concealed within those Georgian walls. Workmen arrived with sledgehammers and crowbars, their task to reduce the architectural impossibility to rubble and memory. The facade that had never possessed a proper door would be rebuilt according to conventional principles, as if the very fabric of the city wished to correct the moral impropriety of a dwelling that had hidden its entry from the world. Holmes moved through the destruction with methodical precision, ensuring that every trace of Blackwood's apparatus was accounted for and destined for the flames. "Some knowledge," he observed to me quietly, "is too dangerous to preserve. The boundary between life and death exists for reasons that transcend human ambition, and those who violate it do so at the peril of their very souls." The journey back to Baker Street was largely silent, each of us contemplating the profound implications of what we had witnessed. The fog that had shrouded London throughout our investigation was finally beginning to lift, revealing the familiar cityscape in all its Victorian complexity, yet somehow transformed by our knowledge of what horrors could lurk behind the most respectable facades. Back in the familiar comfort of 221B, with Mrs. Hudson having rekindled the fire and prepared fresh tea, Holmes settled into his armchair with uncharacteristic gravity. He reached for his violin, his long fingers drawing from it a melancholy phrase that seemed to capture the weight of secrets too heavy for ordinary discourse. "Watson," he said at length, his voice carrying that gentle authority which marked his moments of deepest philosophical reflection, "you are contemplating the implications of what we have witnessed for the future of natural philosophy." "Indeed," I replied, watching the flames consume the final fragments of evidence he had brought from the sealed laboratory. "If such reanimation is scientifically possible, how can we prevent others from attempting similar experiments?" Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe before responding. "We cannot prevent the rediscovery of such principles, my dear fellow. Knowledge, once conceived, has a way of reconceiving itself through independent inquiry. But we have established an important precedent when scientific inquiry ventures into realms that threaten the fundamental nature of human existence. Society possesses both the right and the responsibility to impose moral constraints." He paused, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, a recognition of the terrible fragility that underlies our civilized existence. "Nature, Watson, is not vindictive. She is exact. She suffers tampering to a point and no further. Blackwood reached that point, and the recoil killed him. The advancement of knowledge must be balanced against the preservation of human dignity." A week had scarcely passed when fate, with its taste for irony, sent another client up our familiar stairs, a nervous young barrister with a tale of a disappearing strong-box at Paddington Station. Holmes listened with renewed interest, the shadow of our recent ordeal already giving way to intellectual curiosity about more conventional impossibilities. As our new client departed with promises of investigation, Holmes turned to me with something approaching his old sardonic humor. "From doors that were never built to boxes that vanish in broad daylight, it is a relief to pass from metaphysical impossibilities to those that merely baffle railway porters." He reached for his greatcoat, then paused at the threshold. "When you write this case, Watson, and I know you will, despite my protestations, I suggest you change the names and leave the wires out. The public appetite for sensation is perpetual. There is no need to feed it with recipes for horrors that should remain forever buried." The case of the murder in the house that never had a door had reached its conclusion, leaving behind only the memory of architectural impossibility and the sobering knowledge that the boundaries between life and death are far more fragile than civilized society dares to acknowledge. We had witnessed the ultimate corruption of the scientific method, the transformation of legitimate inquiry into an instrument of unnatural ambition, and had learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some knowledge too perilous to possess. As Holmes departed for Paddington Station and his new puzzle, I found myself contemplating the extraordinary mind that could penetrate even the most impossible mysteries through the application of logic, observation, and moral clarity. The house without a door had finally yielded its secrets, and in doing so had taught us that the most impenetrable barriers are often those we construct within our own souls to protect ourselves from knowledge too dangerous to possess. The morning sun broke through the last wisps of fog, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of London, while somewhere in the distance the sound of sledgehammers continued the work of erasing Edmund Blackwood's impossible legacy from the architectural history of Belgravia. The world was full of locked houses, as Holmes had observed, some of brick and some of bone. The former we might occasionally open, the latter we had best leave to their proper keeper. 3 months had elapsed since the last stone of 47 Eaton Square was carted away, and London had resumed its eternal rhythm of fog and gaslight, commerce and conversation. The elegant Georgian terrace stood complete once more, its architectural conformity restored, as though the city itself had conspired to heal the wound that Edmund Blackwood's ambitions had torn in the fabric of natural law. Where once an impossible house had crouched without a door, a conventional residence now displayed the expected portico and entrance steps, its brass nameplate gleaming respectably in the winter sun. Holmes sat in his familiar chair before the fire, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of books, papers, and scientific apparatus that marked our sitting room as the domain of England's foremost consulting detective. Yet there was something different in his manner, a philosophical gravity that had settled upon him since our confrontation with the reanimated architect, as though the experience had forced him to contemplate questions that extended far beyond the usual boundaries of criminal investigation. The morning papers lay folded upon the table, their headlines proclaiming the mundane crimes and conventional scandals that comprised London's daily diet of sensation. Charles Pemberton's trial had concluded with a sentence of 20 years penal servitude, the charges of conspiracy, embezzlement, and criminally negligent conduct providing a narrative that satisfied legal requirements without venturing into realms that would challenge the very foundations of natural philosophy. "Watson," Holmes said, setting aside his pipe with characteristic deliberation, "I've been reflecting upon the fundamental nature of the mysteries we encounter. Most present themselves as violations of natural law, yet inevitably yield to logical analysis. The case of the murder in the house. That never had a door was different. It forced us to confront the possibility that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, regardless of its scientific validity." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock announced the arrival of the Morning Post. Among the usual collection of potential cases and scientific correspondence lay a letter bearing foreign stamps and the distinctive crest of the Allgemeines Krankenhaus in Vienna. Holmes broke the red seal with obvious interest and handed the sheet to me. "Mr. Holmes," the letter began in Dr. von Dax's neat continental hand, "I have taken a position upon the medical wards, where electricity is permitted only for bell calls and the occasional cautery. I have published a small paper upon therapeutic rest to the nervous system without resort to galvanic stimulus. The work brings peace to my conscience and purpose to my days. I enclose a diagram you will recognize, the only figure that might tempt a weaker man to relapse. Burn it as you burned the rest. Your obedient servant, A. von Dax." Holmes had already fed the folded diagram to the fire before I could examine it fully. For a moment, a delicate curve traced itself in blue upon the coal, some mathematical relationship that defined the threshold between life and death, then crumbled to ordinary ash. "There," Holmes said softly. "We have kept one soul within bounds." I watched the last traces of forbidden knowledge disappear up our chimney, carrying with them the final remnants of Edmund Blackwood's impossible achievement. Do you ever wonder, Holmes, whether we were right to destroy such revolutionary discoveries? The advancement of medical science, Holmes interrupted with gentle firmness, must proceed within moral boundaries, or it ceases to be medicine and becomes something far more sinister. Blackwood crossed those boundaries, and the result was an abomination that challenged the very nature of human existence. He rose and moved to the window, his sharp profile etched against the grey London morning. Lady Aurelia has written from Switzerland, where she has established a charitable foundation for the support of legitimate medical research. Her patronage now flows toward healing rather than the perversion of natural law. Dr. von Dax has found redemption in service to the living rather than the reanimation of the dead. Even Inspector Lestrade has gained wisdom from our encounter with the impossible. Holmes paused, his grey eyes reflecting the weight of secrets too heavy for public discourse. Yet I confess, Watson, that I have received reports from various quarters of the city. Unexplained electrical disturbances, strange sightings in abandoned buildings, instances of apparent resurrection that have been dismissed as hysteria or fraud. Pemberton's financial records suggest that Blackwood's experiments may have been more extensive than we initially discovered. Before I could respond to this troubling revelation, Mrs. Hudson appeared once more, this time announcing a visitor whose presence immediately dispelled the shadow of our recent reflections. A lady of middle years entered our sitting room, plainly dressed, with ink-stained fingers and the harried expression of one whose livelihood depends upon the precise arrangement of words. "Good morning, Mrs. Marlowe," Holmes said as though she had given her name. "A compositor from Fleet Street and, unless I err, seeking the whereabouts of a missing proof that has placed your editor in considerable distress." She started, then laughed despite her obvious anxiety. "Sir, you are either wizard or devil to know such things." "Merely attentive," Holmes replied with something approaching his old sardonic humor. "The violet stain upon your forefinger speaks of printer's ink, while the iron filing upon your skirt suggests proximity to typesetting machinery. Your reticule shows the wear of constant handling, the nervous habit of one whose employment depends upon meeting strict deadlines. But pray, take a seat and tell us of this vanishing proof." As Mrs. Marlowe began her tale of mysteriously disappearing typeset pages, I felt in my own breast that peculiar easing which attends the return to navigable waters after a brush with the edge of the map. Here was a puzzle that, however perplexing, operated within the comfortable boundaries of human motive and mechanical possibility. When our new client had departed with promises of investigation, Holmes settled back into his chair with renewed purpose. "From doors that were never built to proofs that vanish in broad daylight," he observed with satisfaction. "It is a relief, Watson, to pass from metaphysical impossibilities to those that merely baffle Fleet Street compositors." He reached for his greatcoat, then paused at the threshold. "When you write this case, and I know you will despite my protestations, I suggest you change the names and leave out the most disturbing details. The public appetite for sensation is perpetual, but there is no need to feed it with recipes for horrors that should remain forever buried." The afternoon sun broke through the London fog, casting long shadows across the cobblestones of Baker Street, while somewhere in the distance, the sounds of normal commerce and conventional crime provided their familiar symphony. Holmes departed for Fleet Street and his new puzzle, leaving me to contemplate the extraordinary mind that could penetrate even the most impossible mysteries through the application of logic, observation, and unwavering moral clarity. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door had reached its true conclusion, not merely in the identification of a murderer or the exposure of a conspiracy, but in the recognition that some boundaries exist not to limit human knowledge, but to preserve human dignity. We had witnessed the ultimate corruption of the scientific method and had learned that the most impenetrable barriers are often those we must construct within our own souls to protect ourselves from knowledge too dangerous to possess. As I took up my pen to record these final reflections, I found myself thinking of Holmes's words about locks of brick and locks of bone. The former we might occasionally open with patience and proper tools. The latter were best left to their proper keeper. The world was full of mysteries, but not all mysteries were meant to be solved, and wisdom lay in knowing the difference. The house without a door had finally yielded its Secrets, and in doing so, had taught us that the greatest victories are sometimes won not by what we discover, but by what we choose to leave undisturbed. The fog was lifting from London's streets, revealing the familiar cityscape in all its Victorian complexity, yet somehow transformed by our knowledge of what horrors could lurk behind the most respectable facades, and by our determination to ensure that such horrors would never again see the light of day. The winter of 1896 had settled over London with unusual severity, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into landscapes of crystalline beauty that seemed to purify even the most sordid corners of the great metropolis. From our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the view encompassed a world made clean by snow and silence, where the ordinary mysteries of human existence appeared temporarily suspended beneath nature's pristine veil. Holmes had grown increasingly reflective during the months following our encounter with Edmund Blackwood's impossible creation. One does not pass so near the frontier of life and death without bringing back a dust that resists the brush, and I observed in my friend's manner a philosophical gravity that spoke to profound moral questioning rather than mere intellectual satisfaction. His violin had taken on a more contemplative voice, drawing from its strings melodies that whispered of boundaries respected rather than conquered. On this particular evening, as the gas lamps cast their warm glow across the familiar chaos of books and apparatus, Holmes set aside his correspondence and fixed me with that penetrating gaze which I had learned to associate with his moments of deepest reflection. "Watson," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence that marked his most significant observations, "I've been contemplating the true nature of our profession. We style ourselves as seekers of truth, yet our recent experience has taught me that some truths are too dangerous for human comprehension. The question becomes, how does one distinguish between mysteries that should be solved and those that must remain forever sealed?" I set down the medical journal I had been reading, a prosaic account of advances in surgical technique that seemed remarkably innocent after our brush with galvanic reanimation. "You speak as though knowledge itself might be evil, Holmes. Surely the pursuit of understanding is among humanity's noblest impulses." "Indeed," Holmes replied, rising to stand before the fire, his sharp profile etched against the dancing flames. "Yet consider the musician Paganini. He broke strings in performance and yet contrived still to play. There is, I think, a temptation in certain minds to break strings for the sake of proving they can still make music. Blackwood was such a one. Yet the instrument one plays upon is human nature. The strings are laws not ours to snap. We have no right to their music if we force it from silence by violence." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Lady Aurelia Desborough entered our sitting room, though her appearance had been transformed by months of charitable work in the Swiss Alps. The elegant aristocrat had given way to someone whose hands bore the honest calluses of service, whose eyes reflected the peace that comes from meaningful labor rather than idle patronage. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, accepting the chair Holmes offered with graceful dignity. "I've come to London briefly on foundation business, and I wish to express my gratitude once more for your intervention in that terrible affair." Holmes regarded her with obvious respect. "Lady Desborough, your transformation of personal trauma into charitable purpose demonstrates the highest form of moral courage. How proceeds your work with the medical missions?" "We have established 3 hospitals in remote alpine villages," she replied with evident satisfaction, "where the most sophisticated apparatus is a simple stethoscope, and the greatest miracle is the healing that occurs through human compassion rather than mechanical intervention. I've learned that true advancement lies not in conquering nature's limitations, but in working within them to achieve genuine benefit." She produced from her reticule a small leather portfolio. "I've brought you something that may interest you, Mr. Holmes. A letter from Charles Pemberton, written from Pentonville Prison, where he has apparently undergone a profound spiritual awakening." Holmes examined the document with characteristic thoroughness. Pemberton's once elegant handwriting had acquired the careful deliberation of a man who weighs each word against the judgment of his own conscience. The letter spoke of remorse, of nights spent contemplating the moral implications of his ambitions, and of a growing understanding that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, regardless of its potential benefits. He has requested permission to destroy certain documents that remain in his personal effects, Lady Aurelia continued. Calculations and theoretical frameworks that could enable others to replicate Blackwood's experiments. Holmes did not hesitate. Without question, the knowledge that enabled those abominations must not be permitted to survive. Some discoveries are too perilous for human custody. After Lady Aurelia had departed, we found ourselves drawn once more to Eaton Square, where the afternoon light revealed the elegant Georgian terrace restored to perfect architectural conformity. Where once a blank wall had affronted every convention, there now stood a sound and ordinary door, its brass knocker polished to mirror brightness. As we paused upon the opposite pavement, a small event drew our attention to that very entrance. A little girl of 8 or 9, her pinafore clean but much mended, held in one hand a parcel, and with the other reached timidly toward the polished knocker. "Allow me," said Holmes, stepping lightly across to rap the knocker with delicate authority. "A delivery?" "Yes, sir," she said, the words coming out breathless with importance. "From Morley's, sir. New bolts for the stair. The gentleman said they must be fitted proper before the house is decent to sleep in." When the maid had accepted the parcel and the child had departed with a bright coin for her trouble, Holmes turned to me with something approaching his old sardonic humor. "The city has shut a door we had to force, Watson. It is a healthy instinct in masonry and men." A week later, the mundane crept back into our lives with welcome urgency. A frantic telegram arrived from a country vicarage in Sussex, detailing the baffling disappearance of the church organist, along with the entire parish silver collection, just hours before Sunday service. Holmes's eyes, which had held a distant philosophical gleam for so long, now sparkled with renewed enthusiasm. "Ah, Watson," he exclaimed, snatching up the telegram with familiar energy. "A case of missing silver and a vanishing organist, a far cry from reanimated corpses and electrical abominations, would you not agree?" I smiled, feeling profound relief wash over me. "Indeed, Holmes, a welcome return to the terrestrial, if not the entirely conventional." "Precisely," he said, already donning his traveling coat. "The human heart, for all its complexities, rarely requires the intervention of a Ruhmkorff coil. The motives of a parish organist, however perplexing, are generally rooted in the more familiar vices of greed or desperation, rather than a desire to transcend mortality." As he turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, he paused with that characteristic glint in his eye. "When you write this case, Watson, and I know you will despite my protestations, let it serve as a reminder that the advancement of human knowledge must be balanced against the preservation of human dignity. Some doors are meant to remain forever closed, not because we lack the key, but because we possess the wisdom to leave them locked." He smiled and looked sidelong at me from under his brow. "I prefer the violin to the pen. As you know, you arrange the words. I will endeavor to keep you in notes." With that, he was gone, his tall, lean figure disappearing down the stairs, leaving me to contemplate the lingering echoes of a mystery that had stretched the very fabric of my understanding. The case of the murder in the house that never had a door had reached its ultimate conclusion, leaving behind not merely the memory of an architectural impossibility and the solution to an impossible crime, but a profound understanding of the moral boundaries that must constrain human ambition. As I prepared for our journey to Sussex, I reflected that the world was indeed full of locked houses, some of brick and some of bone, some of custom and some of conscience. We had learned that the former might occasionally be opened with patience and proper tools, while the latter were best left to their proper keeper. The greatest victories are sometimes won not by what we discover, but by what we choose to leave undisturbed. The house without a door had finally taught us its greatest lesson, that the most profound mysteries are not those that challenge our intellect, but those that test our moral courage to know when not to know. In such fashion, with the promise of conventional impossibilities ahead and the wisdom of restraint behind us, ended the most extraordinary case in the chronicles of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. A reminder that some boundaries exist not to limit human knowledge, but to preserve the very essence of what makes us human.